I was raised to believe that the Bible defines good and evil for us within its pages. But when we stop and examine this idea using the Bible, we discover something else. In the Garden of Eden, there were two trees, a tree that would bring life to all who ate of its fruit, and a tree that brought death. And it was the second tree, the tree that resulted in death, that contained the knowledge of good and evil. Have we been deceived by the serpent who is trying to get us to eat of this second tree? Is the Bible really trying to define good and evil for us? Let's take a step back. Let's run an experiment. Instead of seeking to define good and evil, let's instead ask the question of the trees. Let's attempt to define life and death, but to do so, we must first seek it out. So join us as we derish chai, as we seek life. Hey everybody, welcome to the Derish Chai Experiment, the show where we make sense of the difficult passages of the Bible. Well, the war for Canaan is on. Last week when we began the war narrative in full, Israel had only defeated Jericho and then Ai in the conquest of the land. Only 2 victories before that last chapter began. Purchase had been found on the far eastern border of Canaan, and the army had only the barest foothold in the land of Canaan. But as we read back in chapter 9, Israel had made a covenant with Gibeon. This covenant required that Israel defend the city should it come under attack, and in chapter 10, the city was attacked by its neighbors. Because the Canaanite forces were focused on Gibeon during their attack on the city, Israel was able to march through the night and launch their own counterattack. This sudden attack by Israel and the Spirit of God threw the enemy forces into disarray, and as they fled, God then rained down hail on the enemy, killing more of the enemy with nature than Israel managed with the sword. The battle, however, continued to drag on throughout the day, and so Joshua prayed to God and commanded the sun and moon to stand still so that Israel could finish the fight that lay before them. By the end of this long day, the armies of the 5 kings have been destroyed, with only a few soldiers escaping to the temporary safety of walled cities in the area. The 5 kings themselves, after being trapped in a cave for a good part of the cleanup, were then killed and hung before Israel until the sun finally set, where they were taken down and then thrown back into the cave where they had hidden. After this victory, the army took time to clean up the southern part of the land, and that is what the remainder of chapter 10 described. The armies of Israel moving from place to place and taking various strongholds. In each city, in each case, there is this repeated idea. They captured it on that day, they struck it with the edge of the sword, and they devoted every person in it to destruction that day. They left no survivors. When it comes to human warfare, this seems egregious, and this is one of several difficult passages in the Bible that cause modern audiences to squirm a bit. This sort of warfare is often called genocide. How can we reconcile this command and other violent actions of God, such as the flood and the plagues, with a God who is good to all, and whose compassion rests on all his works, as Psalm 145 says? Well, there are a few ways to explain this. Some will take the stance that since these massive death narratives, such as the flood and the Exodus and the conquest, are early narratives, that this demonstrates an evolution of Israel and their theology. This evolutionary theory removes God from the picture, and it makes the violence narratives a product of an ancient people trying to find their place in the world and develop what would only later become a fully realized theology. Now, we can safely discard this view because it's based on a human-centric version of the Torah. Men created the Torah and just weren't sophisticated enough to imagine a God who was non-violent. Another view that some have taken is to pit Jesus against God. This view states that since Yeshua is God incarnate, that we should then measure every description and depiction of God elsewhere in the Bible according to the picture that we get of Yeshua in the Gospels. And since Jesus is depicted as loving and gracious and kind, and these narratives seem everything but that, then the God that is depicted in the Old Testament is somehow a different God, or a different phase of God. But to this I would point to the book of Revelation, where Yeshua is depicted as destroying the enemies of God wholesale in chapter 19, going so far as to destroy every man in the armies that stand against him. Now, there's one scholar named Gregory Boyd who goes so far as to make the claim that God desired for the Canaanites to be removed from the land using non-violent means. But Moses and the Israelites misunderstood this as a result of their, quote, low spiritual state. And the conquest was a result of the, quote, fallen desire of Moses, and it was not a command of God. Again, this makes the commands such as Deuteronomy 17 to destroy all the members of certain nations into a human command and not a God-given command. It states that Moses misheard or misinterpreted God, or high-handedly claimed that God told him to do something that God had not actually said. This sort of view casts doubt on the entire Torah, because if Moses made up this command, what other commands did Moses make up because of his low spiritual state? Another stance in this view is to assume that the destruction narratives were not literal, they're simply allegorical, since a God of love would not destroy entire nations. But again, Revelation begs to differ. Yes, God is love, but God is also justice, and his justice cannot be thwarted except through repentance. So what does justice demand of a people who are unrepentant? It demands that they are held accountable for the crimes that they have committed. Again, we can discard this view not only because it makes the entire Bible untrustworthy, but also because it completely leaves out an essential part of God's character that is clearly stated in the Bible. After all, which part of God's commands were simply the fallen wishes of Moses or a later scribe? And which part of God's character can we then discard as not real because our idea of who a God should be does not match the description of who God is? So many of these attempts at softening these narratives are done because humans seek to make God in their own image. We want a God who is all love and no vengeance or wrath or justice, because that gives us a God that would never judge us. And this gives us then allowance for us to continue in our own sins, safe in the knowledge that we are okay. We will not be taken to account for the evil that we have done. And that is a false God and a false view of God. God is justice as well as love. God is vengeance as well as mercy. God is wrath as well as compassion. We must never take the side of God that we like and make that into the only side of God, lest we create God in our own image. The simple fact is that these violence narratives cannot be easily explained away in a manner that makes them palatable to modern audiences. The sheer scope and repeating occurrences of God's violence towards men demand that we treat this topic seriously and recognize that God does not fit into the modern ideas of what love means. We must also recognize that the conquest narrative is directly connected to God's choice of Israel above other nations and God's promise to give Israel the land of Canaan. Alongside this, it was his purpose to dispossess the people of the land because of their wickedness, which is an acting out of his justice, as we read in Deuteronomy 9, verse 3. And so we find here an element of God using his chosen people as the means of judgment against nations that had gone too far in their perversion. Israel became the scalpel of sorts that removed this cancer from the earth. This can be difficult to wrestle with, especially in the modern age when we have seen this idea abused, but it does seem to be one of the factors at play in this narrative. But this is not the primary reason for the conquest. The primary reason, based on the number of times it's mentioned in the Bible, is God's fulfillment of the promise that he made to Abraham to give Israel the land of Canaan. This was God's land after all, and he was giving it to his people. And as the landowner, he had the right to kick out the current tenants through whatever means necessary, if they would not leave on their own, and frankly, plenty of them did leave on their own. But those who were left behind were to be destroyed. Because if they were simply forced out of their home, they'd be back to try to reclaim what had been taken from them. So while this narrative might make us or others uncomfortable, it does reveal the lengths that God is willing to go to ensure that his promises are fulfilled and that justice is achieved. And this should give us all a bit of pause as we consider this. Justice is a quality of God alongside his love and mercy. And if you continue to act contrary to him, his compassion and mercy can be exhausted. Israel has discovered this time and time again in the wilderness, and this is a fact that Canaan is now discovering firsthand. Eventually, time will run out on unrepentant and rampant sin, and God will call those engaged in this to account. And that is what we are encountering here in the conquest narratives. This week, the war narrative continues. In chapter 10, Israel cleared out the south of Canaan. Everything from the west of the landing point of Gilgal on down to the southern borders has been cleansed of enemy, with some few exceptions which we'll read at the end of this chapter. Today, though, in chapter 11, Israel takes the battle to the north of Canaan. Joshua chapter 11. And it came to be when Yavin, king of Hatzor, heard that he sent Jobab, sovereign of Madon, and the king of Shimron, and the king of Aksaph, and to the kings who were in the north, in the mountains, and in the desert plain south of Kinnerot, and in the low country, in the heights of Dor in the west, and the Canaanites in the east and the west, and the Amorites, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Jebusite in the mountains, and the Chavite below Hermon in the land of Mitzpah. And they went out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as numerous as the sands on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. And all these kings met together, and they came and camped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. And Adonai said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of their presence, for tomorrow about this time I am giving all of them over to Israel slain. Hamstring their horses, and burn their chariots with fire." And Joshua and all the soldiers with him came against them suddenly by the waters at Merom, and they fell on them. And Adonai gave them into the hand of Israel, and they struck them and pursued them to the great Sidon, and to Mizraphot Maim, in the valley of Mitzpeh, eastward. And they struck them until there was no survivor left. And Joshua did to them as Adonai said to them. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. And Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hatzor and struck its king with the sword, for Hatzor was formerly the head of all those kingdoms. And he struck all the beings who were in it with the edge of the sword, putting them under the ban. He did not leave anyone breathing. Then he burned Hatzor with fire. And Joshua captured the cities of those kings and all their kings, and he struck them with the edge of the sword. He put them under the ban, as Moses, the servant of Adonai, commanded. However, Israel did not burn any cities that stood on their mounds, but Joshua burned only Hatzor. And all the spoil of these cities and the livestock and the children of Israel took as bounty for themselves. But they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they destroyed them, and they did not leave anyone breathing. As Adonai commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He did not turn aside a word from all that Adonai commanded Moses. Thus Joshua took all this land, the mountain country and all the south, and all the land of Goshen, and the low country, and the desert plain, and the mountains of Israel and its lowlands, from Mount Chalak that goes up to Seir, as far as Baal-Gad in the valley of Lebanon, and below Mount Hermon. And he captured all the kings and struck them and killed them. Joshua fought with all these kings for a long time. There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All the others they took in battle, for it was of Adonai to strengthen their hearts so that they should come against Israel in battle, in order to put them under the ban, so that they might have no favor, but that he might annihilate them as Adonai had commanded Moses. And at that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains of Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua put them with their cities under the ban, and there was none of the Anakim left in the land of the children of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod some remained. And Joshua took the entire land according to all that Adonai had said to Moses. And Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel, according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land rested from fighting. As this chapter opens, the kings of the north gathered together to fight against Israel as one large mass. The description of this army is telling, as in verse 4 it states that this army that stood in opposition to Israel was as numerous as the sands on the seashore. This descriptive idiom should cause our ears to perk up, as it's been used twice before in the Bible to describe a mass of people that's too large to count. We've seen this description in Genesis 22:17, that I shall certainly bless you, and I shall certainly increase your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and let your seed possess the gates of their enemies. After Abraham willingly offered Isaac up as a sacrifice and was stopped at the last minute, Abraham is then promised that his offspring will be as the sands of the seashore. And then again in Genesis 32:12, for you said, I shall certainly do good to you, and shall make your seed as the sands of the sea, which are too numerous to count. As Jacob is about to meet Esau, Jacob recounts this promise that God had made to him, to make his descendants as the sands of the seashore, as a way of encouraging himself. In both of these cases, it is Israel that is said to be as numerous as the sands of the seashore. But outside of these mentions in Genesis, this description is used for both Israel and the enemies gathered against Israel elsewhere in the Bible. Judges 7:12 uses this idiom to describe the Midianites and the Amalekites that stand before Gideon and his 300 men. 1 Samuel 13:5 is the Philistines that have gathered against Israel and Saul that are called as numerous as the sands on the sea. Revelation 20 verse 8, it's Gog and Magog that rise in the war at the end of the 1,000-year reign to surround Jerusalem, only to be utterly destroyed with fire from heaven. The point is this. Sand of the seashore, it's not an idiom that's reserved for Israel. It is used of many large masses of people throughout the Bible. But there's another idiom that is used in conjunction with sands of the seashore that is reserved exclusively for Israel. And that idiom is, as the stars of the heavens. 4 times in Genesis, once in Exodus, 3 times in the book of Deuteronomy, and multiple other places outside of the Torah, it is stated that Israel had or will become as numerous as the stars in the heaven. So here in Joshua 11, when the kings of the north gather against Israel, we find a picture of sorts of the sands of the seashore being pitted against the stars of the heavens in battle. These two great masses of people that are uncountable. But the sands of the seashore, the enemies of Israel, they have a technological advantage in this case. They have horses and chariots. In ancient warfare, especially at this time in history, horses and chariots were a huge advantage. All things being considered from a materiel standpoint, Israel should have lost this battle. Armies that are even in number but uneven in weaponry, meeting in an open field of battle, should have resulted in a loss from the side without the weapons. But there was one weapon that Israel had that turned the tide of battle, and that's their God. We thank God for their sake that He is a God who is willing to use violence and isn't all cuddles and grins. Without God on their side, Israel would have never survived this fight. Their technologically superior enemy would have put them to flight and broken their confidence of ever being able to be victorious. Now, as Joshua is looking out over this opposing force, he is given a command that, once again, doesn't make a whole lot of human sense. God tells Joshua to burn their chariots and hamstring their horses. This thing that gave the enemy such a huge technological as well as a tactical advantage, God says, don't pick it up and use it in your favor. Instead, destroy these weapons. Place yourself at a continued disadvantage in the upcoming fights. The underlying idea is that Israel needs to continue to trust in God for their victory, and not in the weapons they bore. We see this sort of idea repeated throughout Scripture. When God wins a war or provides for their needs or heals their diseases, He wants to make sure that He is the one who gets the glory. We see this in the stories of Moses striking the rock in the book of Numbers, the story of Gideon and Judges, and the story of Naaman in 1 Kings, just to name a few. In Moses' case, Moses took the glory that belonged to God and placed it on himself. "Shall we bring forth the water for you?" Moses said when striking the rock. as if it were his power or the power of his staff that accomplished this task. With Gideon, God forced Gideon to whittle down his 32,000-man army to just 300 men. Why? Because if they had more, Israel would have claimed strength of arms had given them the victory, rather than strength of their God had given them the victory. And Naaman, he was simply asked to wash in the Jordan 7 times in order to cure his leprosy. Naaman initially balked at this request, but eventually relented, and when he did what was asked, he was cleansed. If any man had accomplished this task, Naaman would have blessed and praised the man. But there was no one to praise but God when he was cleansed in the river. Throughout the Bible, God asks men and women to purposefully weaken themselves or remove themselves from the hand of other men so that his power might be manifest. As 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness." Israel certainly wasn't weak at this point in the narrative. But had they acquired advanced weaponry, they might have stopped trusting in God for their salvation. They might have started to trust in their own power to win their battles. And if that had been the case, Israel would have then lost from then on. We saw it before in Ai. Israel went into battle expecting an easy win because of numbers. But if battle was simply a numbers game, then Israel would have won that first battle against Ai. But they didn't because God was not with them. Instead, Israel was sent packing despite their numbers. Instead, God asks us to make ourselves weak in the sight of others so that his power might be manifested. So that whatever victory might be achieved is simply a result of his power and not attributable to human intervention at all. This is why Israel circumcised themselves before the Battle of Jericho. Weak and helpless, limping soldiers cannot win a battle. And yet the battle was won despite this handicap. Not because of better weapons or better strategy or greater numbers, but because the very rocks of the city responded to the call of God, declared their allegiance to God by falling and allowing the soldiers of Israel to then enter. And this is the point. We must be willing to embrace weakness for the sake of the gospel, because success is not in our hands at all. Success happens because of obedience, and the success that is achieved must be completely attributed to God, not to self. So let's sum up what we've learned. As we've been going through the book of Joshua, we've been looking at this book through the lens of spiritual warfare, because our battle is not with flesh and blood, and the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. Instead, our war is spiritual, and our enemy is spiritual. We have learned many lessons already from this book, and each of them is applicable to the fight that we all face. So let's go through them. 1. Have faith in God and remain faithful to him. He goes before you and has put his own fear within the enemy. 2. The enemy does fear you, not because of you, but because of the God that is with you. They've heard of and witnessed the power of God and are afraid of those who are willing and capable of using his power against them. 3. Step out in faith and take risks, and God will meet you and part waters for you. Sometimes you have to get your feet wet and step into the proverbial sea before you see God move. But when you do, if it is of him, he will meet you there and make a way. 4. God's power and authority is all that is needed to win. Human weapons, wisdom, strategies, insight, and reason will not win this fight. Only obedience to God and his power can hope to win this fight. 5. Remove all sin from your camp before you fight. We cannot harbor secret sin and still think that we are able to fight for God. Our sin must be destroyed from our midst. 6. Some battles require strategy, but rely only on God to provide the strategy in each case. There are countless books and guides available on how to engage in spiritual warfare, and all of them are only ideas. There is no one single strategy that will work every time. We must listen to God's guidance when we engage in spiritual warfare. 7, do not make a covenant with the enemy. It is easy to come into alignment with the ideas and the thoughts of the enemy, to give him a place in your camp. If you do, make it serve you. But even better, don't come into agreement with the lies of the enemy at all. 8, use the authority that God has given you. God has, through Yeshua, given us the power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and all the power of the enemy is subject to us. We must use this authority in the fight, and this is done through spoken command. Number 9, take no prisoners. Drive them all out. This does not have to happen all at once. In fact, it can be harmful for it to all happen at once. But don't give up just because you've experienced 1 or 2 victories. Don't give up just because you're too tired. Keep the pressure on until the victory is won. And this week we can add 2 more lessons. Number 10, God gets all of the glory for any victory that's achieved. We win in our weakness. Do not rejoice that the spirits are subject to you. Rejoice only that your name is written in the book of life. We must be sure that we don't take credit for being a useful tool in the hands of the master, for that is all that we are. And 11, probably the hardest one of all, weakness is strength. I know that sounds Orwellian, but it's biblical. This is because our own strength is useless in a spiritual battle. We have no spiritual strength in and of ourselves. God's strength and God's authority are all that matter. And so we must learn to embrace weakness and inability and rely solely on His power and His ability. Because He is the one who grants power to those who don't rely on their own power. He is the one who grants authority to the humble. He is the one who uses the weak to confound the powerful and the foolish to confound the wise. He is the one who seeks the broken and the sick and raises them up in service to Him. He is the one who gives victory when there is no other way. And He is the one who deserves all glory and honor for any and all victories that are achieved. It's only through Him that life can be found. So Derish Chai, seek life in all that you do. Shalom. Thank you for tuning in to Derish Chai. If this content has blessed you and you would like more, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing with others. To find out more about what we do and to support this ministry, head over to seeklifesc.com. That's seeklifesc.com. We'll see you again next time as we Derish Chai, as we seek life. Shalom.